I wasn't the loudest one in the room. I wasn't the one with the best grades or the sharpest tongue or the story everyone wanted to hear at Thanksgiving. I was just the one who showed up. The one who answered the phone at 2 a.m. The one who drove 4 hours without asking why. The one who co-signed the lease when no one else would. That was my role in this family, and for a long time, I told myself it was enough. My brother and I grew up close. People used to say we were the same person split into two bodies. Same laugh, same stubborn streak, same habit of holding grudges longer than we should. When our parents divorced and our mom moved into a smaller apartment in Cincinnati, it was the two of us who figured it out. He was 17, I was 20. I was already working full-time at an accounting firm, already learning what it meant to stretch a paycheck across two people's needs instead of one. He was still in high school, still figuring out who he was. I didn't mind. I really didn't. I told myself that's what older sisters did. His name was Declan, and for 29 years, I thought I knew exactly who he was. He met Fiona at a work conference in Atlanta 3 years ago. She was in marketing, he was in logistics, and apparently they bonded over bad hotel coffee and a missed connecting flight. He called me the same night he got home, talking fast the way he always did when he was excited, and I remember laughing because I hadn't heard him sound like that in years. He'd been in a long, slow-draining relationship before that had left him quiet and careful, and hearing him light up over a stranger was genuinely one of the better phone calls I'd had that year. I liked Fiona at first. I want to be honest about that. She was sharp and funny, and she had this way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the room when she focused on you. The first time we met for dinner, a Thai place near my apartment in Columbus, she asked me questions all night. What was it like growing up with Declan? What were our parents like? Did I always want to go into accounting, or was that a detour? I remember walking home thinking she was exactly what he needed. Someone curious, someone warm. What I didn't see yet was how quickly that warmth could switch off. By the time they got engaged, 18 months into the relationship, I had already become the unofficial financial backbone of their plans. It started small, the way these things always do. Declan asked if I could float him $1,000 when his car needed work and his paycheck was 2 weeks out. I said yes. A few months later, Fiona mentioned she'd found a venue she loved for the engagement party, but it was a little over what they'd budgeted. Could I cover the difference? It was $400. I said yes. Then it was $700 for a rehearsal dinner deposit, then $1,100 for photographer consultation fees because the photographer they wanted required a non-refundable hold. At some point, the math stopped adding up to small favors and started adding up to something else, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. They were planning a wedding. Weddings were expensive. I was doing well enough at work that I could absorb it. And Declan was my brother. By the time the engagement had been going for 8 months, I had contributed just over $14,000 to various wedding-related expenses, mostly deposits, some vendor payments, a few things Fiona described as essential without much follow-up explanation. I had not been asked to be in the wedding party. I had been given the title of family coordinator, which, as far as I could tell, meant I handled logistics, called vendors when there were problems, and showed up early to every event to make sure things ran smoothly. Not bridesmaid, not maid of honor, coordinator. I told myself it was a role that suited me. I was organized. I was good at details. I didn't need the sash. The call came on a Tuesday evening in February. I was making dinner, pasta, nothing complicated, and my brother's name came up on my phone. I turned the stove down and answered. He didn't say hello the way he usually did. There was a pause, and then he said, "Hey, so we need to talk about the wedding party situation." I set the spoon down on the counter. He told me that Fiona had been thinking about it and that they had decided to keep the wedding party small, immediate family and closest friends only. He said it in the careful, even tone of someone reading from a script they'd rehearsed. I said, "Okay, so who's in it?" He listed 5 names. None of them were mine. I said, "What am I doing?" He said, "You're still the coordinator." There was a long pause. I was looking at the pot on the stove, the water starting to simmer at the edges, and I was doing everything I could to keep my voice level. "Declan," I said, "I've put $14,000 into this wedding." He said, "We're really grateful for that." "I'm not asking for gratitude. I'm asking why I'm the coordinator and not standing up there with you." Another pause, and then he said, "Fiona feels like the energy would be off with the dynamic." "What dynamic?" He didn't answer that directly. He said something about how Fiona had a specific vision and how she thought the party should reflect the couple and how they hoped I understood. I said I understood and I got off the phone as quickly as I could. Then I stood in my kitchen for about 10 minutes, not doing anything. The water boiled over and I didn't move to fix it. That night, I started writing down numbers. Not because I planned to do anything with them, I genuinely wasn't sure what I was going to do, but because I needed to see them somewhere outside my own head. $14,260, not counting my time, not counting the 4-hour drives, not counting the 2 vacation days I'd used to help Fiona shop for bridesmaids' dresses for women who were not me. The phrase energy would be off kept circling back. I didn't say anything to Declan for 2 weeks. I kept doing my coordinator job. I confirmed the catering head count. I followed up with the florist about the centerpiece samples. I sent a reminder to the photographer about the timeline. I was professional and reliable, and I answered every email within 24 hours. And I was watching. I don't know exactly when I started paying closer attention, but somewhere in those 2 weeks I noticed a pattern in what Fiona said versus what actually happened. Little things at first. She'd told the venue coordinator one thing and told me something different about the cocktail hour timing. She'd told the florist the budget had been approved by the family for an upgrade I had definitely not approved. She told my brother that I had agreed to cover the remaining photography balance, a balance of $2,200, without ever asking me. I found out when the photographer emailed me a payment reminder. I called Declan about the photographer invoice. He said he thought I knew. I said I didn't. He said Fiona must have miscommunicated. He said he was sorry. His voice sounded genuinely confused, which meant either he really didn't know or he was better at performing innocence than I'd given him credit for. I said, "Has she done this before?" Told people I agreed to things I didn't agree to. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it." I didn't push it, but I started keeping records of everything after that. Every email, every text, every phone call I could document. 3 weeks before the wedding, I got a text from Fiona directly. It was a Saturday morning. I was at the gym, and I looked at my phone between sets and read it twice before I fully processed what it said. It said, "Hey, quick heads up. We've decided to simplify the coordinator role for the actual wedding day. My aunt is going to handle day of coordination since she's done it before. You're still welcome to come as a guest if you want to, but you don't need to worry about logistics anymore. Thanks for everything you've done." I read it a third time. I set my phone down on the bench next to me and I stared at the wall for a while. She had removed me from the one role they had given me instead of a place in the wedding party. Not even that. She'd done it by text. On a Saturday morning. With a "thanks for everything you've done" at the end, like I was a contractor she was releasing after the job was done. Except the job wasn't done. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and I had $14,000 in that wedding. I didn't text back right away. I went home and I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and I pulled up the spreadsheet I'd been keeping. I looked at every line item. I looked at which payments were mine outright, things I'd paid directly, and which ones I had contributed to jointly. Then I opened my email and I started making calls. The first call was to the florist. I had a signed contract with the florist because I had been the one to put my credit card down for the deposit. I explained that there had been a change in plans and I needed to discuss the contract. The florist was sympathetic. She'd dealt with complicated family wedding situations before, and she walked me through the cancellation terms. I would forfeit the deposit, which was mine to forfeit, but the remaining balance would not be charged to my card. The second call was to the catering company. Same situation. I was the primary contact on the contract. I called the coordinator I'd been working with for 4 months, and I told her there had been a significant change in the guest count, and I needed to adjust the contract accordingly. I reduced the guaranteed head count from 112 to 0, and I explained that the event was being restructured. She asked if the event was being canceled. I said I wasn't sure, but that my financial commitment to the contract was ending as of this conversation. The third call was to the photographer. I explained that I would not be covering the remaining balance and that if the couple wanted to keep the booking, they would need to establish a new payment arrangement directly with the studio. Then I texted Fiona back. I said, "Thanks for letting me know. Since I won't be coordinating, I've also gone ahead and removed myself from the vendor contracts I was managing. Declan has all the contact info. Hope it all comes together." I put my phone down and made myself a cup of coffee. The response came 47 minutes later. It was not calm. I didn't respond to the messages immediately. I let them come in for a while, from Fiona, then from Declan, then from Fiona again, then from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Fiona's mother. I read all of them. I noted the progression from angry to panicked to something that, by about the fourth message, started sounding like negotiation. Declan called twice. The second time I answered. He was not yelling, but he was not calm either. He said, "What did you do?" I said, "I removed myself from the vendor contracts I was managing." He said, "The caterer just called Fiona. They said the contract's been reduced to 0 guests." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's our wedding." I said, "I know." There was a silence that lasted long enough that I could hear him breathing. I said, "Declan, Fiona texted me this morning to tell me I wasn't coordinating anymore and I could come as a guest if I felt like it. After $14,000 and 4 months of work, I was removed from my own brother's wedding by text." He said, "She didn't mean it like that." I said, "How did she mean it?" He didn't have an answer for that. I said, "I'm not trying to destroy your wedding. I'm telling you what happens when the person who's been carrying this financially gets removed from it without a conversation. You want the vendors back on track. You call them, you give them your card number. That's how this works." He said, "We don't have the money for all of this up front." I said, "I know." Another silence. He said, "So what do you want?" I had thought about this. I had it planned it as leverage. I want to be honest about that too. I hadn't called the vendors thinking I would use it as a bargaining chip. I had called them because I was done, because I had been told clearly that I was not family enough to stand in this wedding, and I had decided to accept that at full value. But he was asking what I wanted, so I told him. I said, "I want you to tell me honestly, not what Fiona thinks, not what makes the next 3 weeks easier, whether you actually wanted me standing next to you at this wedding." The pause that followed was the longest of the whole conversation. And then he said, "Yeah, I did." His voice was quiet when he said it, different from the rest of the conversation, less defended, more like the brother I'd grown up with. I said, "Okay, then that's what I want." What happened over the next 72 hours was not simple, and I'm not going to pretend it was. There were conversations between Declan and Fiona that I was not part of. There was a phone call from my mom that lasted 2 hours and covered a lot of ground we'd been avoiding for years. There was a long, uncomfortable dinner at Declan's apartment where Fiona sat across from me and the air between us was thin and careful. She didn't apologize exactly. She said she had been under a lot of stress and that she hadn't handled the communication well. She said she knew I had done a lot for the wedding. She said she hoped we could move past it. I nodded at the right moments, and I said the right things because what I was actually doing was deciding, quietly, what kind of relationship I was willing to have with her going forward. The answer I landed on was a polite one, not close. Not the sister-in-law I would call when things got hard. A polite, functional, holidays and birthdays relationship. That was what I could honestly offer. I was reinstated as a bridesmaid 4 days after that dinner, not maid of honor. Fiona's college roommate kept that, but I was in the wedding party. I stood on the left side of the altar in a sage green dress that I'd had no say in choosing, holding a bouquet of white peonies, and I watched my brother's face when Fiona came down the aisle. He looked like someone who had figured out exactly where he wanted to be. And despite everything, that was real. I could see it, and I could be glad for it even while holding all the rest. What I remember most about that day is not the ceremony or the reception or the first dance. It's a moment that happened near the end of the night, after the cake had been cut and the dance floor had thinned out. Declan found me at the bar, getting a glass of water, and he stood next to me for a minute without saying anything. Then he said, "I should have handled this differently from the beginning." I said, "Yeah, you should have." He said, "I'm sorry." I looked at him. He wasn't looking for absolution. He wasn't doing that thing people do when they apologize and immediately wait for you to tell them it's fine. He was just saying it, letting it sit. I said, "I know." We stood there for a while longer, not talking, watching the remaining guests move around the dance floor. It wasn't a resolution exactly. It wasn't everything going back to the way it was before, but it was honest. And at that point, honest was the most I had to work with. There are things I've learned since then that I'm still figuring out how to hold. One is that being the capable one in a family is not the same as being valued by that family. I spent years believing that showing up and solving problems was a form of belonging. It isn't, or at least it isn't automatically. Belonging requires the other people in the equation to actively choose you, not just accept what you offer. Another thing I've learned is that my financial generosity had been making it too easy for certain patterns to continue. When I removed myself from those vendor contracts, I wasn't punishing anyone. I was finally letting the situation cost what it actually cost. That's not cruelty. That's just reality being allowed to exist. I still talk to Declan. We're in a different place now, more careful with each other, more honest in a way we maybe weren't before. He knows I won't be a financial cushion the way I used to be. I know he's trying, in his way, to be the brother I need him to be. It's slower work than I'd like, but it's work we're both doing. Fiona and I are exactly as polite as I decided we would be. She sends me birthday texts, and I send them back. At Christmas, she is warm and competent, and I appreciate both of those things from a comfortable distance. And I still have the spreadsheet. I haven't deleted it, not because I'm holding on to it as evidence of something, but because I look at it sometimes when I need to remember what it cost me to learn that you cannot buy your way into a place at the table. You can only stop subsidizing the people who are making you eat standing up. That's the part I'm still carrying. That's the part that doesn't have a clean ending. But I'm learning to put it down. I keep thinking about the moment I was standing in my kitchen, water boiling over on the stove, holding my phone after Declan said the energy would be off. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just stood there, and something quietly shifted in me, the way a floorboard finally gives after years of too much weight. What happened between me and my brother wasn't just about a wedding. It was about a pattern that had been running for years, and the pattern only ran because I kept feeding it. Every time I said yes without being asked, every time I absorbed a cost without naming it, every time I told myself that's just what you do for family. I was teaching the people around me that my generosity had no floor, that there was no version of this where I stopped showing up with my checkbook in my silence. The thing about being the capable one is that people stop checking whether you're okay with things, they just assume. Fiona assumed I had agreed to the photography invoice. Declan assumed I knew. Neither of them asked, because in every situation before that one, it hadn't mattered whether they asked. I would have covered it anyway. That's not their failure alone, that's mine too. Integrity, the real kind, not the performance of it, means being honest about what you can and can't carry. I had not been honest. I had been carrying things I resented carrying and calling it love, and resentment dressed up as love is one of the more corrosive things I know. The part that took me longer to understand was that what I did, pulling myself from those vendor contracts, wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. It was me finally letting the situation cost what it actually cost, instead of subsidizing a version of events where my presence was optional but my money was not. That required something I'd been short on for a long time: the honesty to look at what was happening without softening it, and the nerve to act on what I saw even when it was going to make things hard. And then there's Declan's pause. That long, quiet pause when I asked him if he'd actually wanted me standing next to him. I think about that pause more than I think about any of the anger, any of the vendor calls, any of the messages from Fiona's mother. Because inside that pause was the truth we'd both been avoiding, that he had let something wrong happen and he knew it, and knowing it hadn't been enough to make him stop it. That takes a particular kind of courage to admit. He found it eventually, late, but he found it. I'm not the same person I was before this happened. I don't think I'm harder, exactly, but I'm more honest. With myself first, and then with the people I love. I've stopped confusing sacrifice with connection. I've stopped letting the size of what I give stand in for the conversation I should be having. And when I feel that familiar pull to just handle it, to just absorb it, to just be the one who shows up with no questions, I stop and I ask myself whether I'm doing it out of love or out of fear that if I stop, I'll find out I was never really wanted at all. That question used to terrify me. It doesn't anymore, because I already got the answer and I survived it. And the answer, it turned out, was more complicated and more hopeful than I'd feared. I can work with complicated. I've been doing it my whole life.